are now able to welcome Kevin Inston, who comes to us from French.
So the title of my presentation is Michel Leiris, the ethnographer faced with colonialism. And Michel Leiris was a French anthropologist. For Michel Leiris, the role of the anthropologist is not to attempt to fix and know the cultural or racialized other, but to expose the illusory nature of any attempt to do so. Anthropology can strive to be objective, he argues, only if it acknowledges the subjective dimension which shapes and mediates all representations of otherness, and which should expose those representations to an interminable process of critique and redefinition. His essay, L'Ethnographer devant le Colonialisme, the ethnographer faced with colonialism, published in the 1950s, actually in 1950, is considered to be the first attempt by an anthropologist to reflect on the ideological and epistemological limits imposed by colonialism on anthropological fieldwork. For Leiris, the anthropologist cannot detach himself from the violence and oppression caused by colonial rule without becoming politically compromised. Not to study the effects of colonialism is to perpetuate the lie of its humanitarian and civilizing mission. His essay on anthropology and colonialism forms part of his work on the question of race and racial prejudice. It is from this work that Leiris aims to develop a form of anthropology committed to raising consciousness of freedom. He seeks to transform his discipline from one which aims to describe what we are, as this would simply risk reproducing current hierarchies, to one that generates who we are by distancing us from the identities and values we take for granted by highlighting their contingency. It is the way anthropology can disrupt identities and identifications which, Leiris believes, allows it potentially to participate in the ongoing process of combating racism. Before exploring this idea further, I want to consider the wider context of the anti-racist discourse in which Leiris' writings is often located. Leiris' essay, Race and Culture, published in 1951, forms part of a compendium of articles on the question of race and racial prejudice commissioned by the international organisation UNESCO in the wake of World War II. The anti-racist discourse of UNESCO sought to oppose racism and its pseudo-scientific basis by explaining human difference in terms of cultural diversity. Its main argument is that human beings are shaped by cultures rather than innate racial differences. No culture can claim to be pure and original because all cultures are intercultural, based on a continual process of borrowing and transforming practices, techniques, and values that they adopt from one another. As cultures are highly mobile, always open to external influences and change, then human beings, being culturally shaped, cannot be fixed within rigid categories which predetermine who or what they are and how they should be treated. The UNESCO tradition called for the terms culture and ethnicity to be used as terms of markers of human difference over racial descriptors, believing that these terms lacked the hierarchical connotations of race. However, it's the UNESCO movement's cultural solution to the question of race which has come under attack. By focusing on culture, the movement is criticised for circumventing a discussion of the historical links between race and the nation state, for depoliticising the question of race by neglecting the inequalities and oppression rooted in alleged racial differences. Such a criticism, however, is not entirely true of Leiris. His essay, Race and Culture, concludes by affirming the social and economic origins of race prejudice. With bitter irony, Leiris argues that race thinking came into its own with the birth of modern democracy after the French Revolution. Race science provided a convenient means of justifying the violation of the rights of sections of humanity, which the Declaration of Universal Freedom and Equality threw into dispute. Race and class become closely linked for Leiris, as racism works to introduce or perpetuate a class system in order to naturalise social inequalities. As a mode of thought, its power lies in its ability to fix the frontiers of the human, to produce an idea of humanity by indicating what humanity is not, to explain why there are always exceptions to inclusion in the ideal of universal humanity. If racism helps to found and perpetuate an unequal social and economic order, then the only way to combat racism, Leiris believes, is for that order to be contested and radically changed by the people subjected to it. For this process to begin, the contingency of the social order, which racist ideology seeks to negate, has to be reactivated. The work of anthropologists for Leiris is to highlight the limits of any social order, to expose the socially constructed character of what appears given or self-evident, to participate in the process of repoliticizing divisions and identities. It is this conviction which underlies his appeal in 1950 to the anthropologist to reflect on his implication in colonialism and to use his expertise to help anti-colonial movements in their fight for emancipation. Leiris points out the geographical and historical links between anthropology and colonialism. Anthropology indicates developed parallel with European expansion, and while any society could be the object of anthropological investigation, anthropologists have tended to study societies belonging to colonial territory. Despite this, anthropologists are yet, at the time Leiris is writing, according to him, to study the effects of colonialism, choosing to focus on the folklore and myth of colonised societies in the pursuit, he believes, of some illusory, pure native culture which supposedly existed prior to European invasion. Leiris opposes the folkloric tradition, arguing that in order to fulfil the scientific demand for impartiality, the anthropologist has to study subjects in their actual political state, rather than referring back to some ethnocentric illusion of cultural integrity. The attempt to retrieve and then preserve a traditional way of life seeks to freeze a people at a given point in time. It actually jeopardizes the survival of a culture because it closes it off to the future, denying that people the right to participate in the historical shaping of their societies. As a result, Leiris calls on the anthropologist to work with colonized subjects rather than on them, by defending their aspirations even if they conflict with those of the anthropologist nation-state, by documenting for Europeans the oppression and exploitation caused by their nations, and by using their findings to help the cause of the anti-colonial movements in their struggle for emancipation. Those struggles for Leiris need to be urgently represented because they represent a moment when the false division between superior and inferior on which colonial rule rests becomes destabilised. Those deemed racially inferior prove their equality with their superiors by claiming and acting on their right to direct and govern themselves through resistance. Equality is not something to be granted by European authorities. The very act of granting equality contradicts itself, as it maintains a relation of dominant and subordinate. Subjects enact and verify their equality by refusing to play the roles prescribed for them by the powerful, by behaving in ways which go beyond the estimation of their capabilities made by their social order, by participating in the political sphere from which they have been excluded. The anthropologist, he believes, has a responsibility in studying and documenting these moments of political disruption. So while the birth of modern democracy, rooted in the ideal of universal freedom and equality, provided, according to Leiris, a convenient context for the spread of racism so as to justify existing inequalities and exclusions, the very same democratic ideals can be used to expose the wrong of racial hierarchies as anti-colonial movements enact the right to freedom and equality, the right to self-determination, which underpin the constitutions of the colonising nation, but which that nation chooses to violate. However, despite his dream of a committed anthropology, an anthropology committed to raising consciousness of human freedom, Leiris closes his essay on L'Ethnographe devant le Colonialisme by drawing attention to the political limits of his discipline. Liberation from colonial rule will require, he believes, more immediate and violent intervention than any anthropological intervention could engender. For Leiris, rule by force can only be overthrown by force. Thank you.